Hello, dear viewers. Welcome to Midnight Dark Stories. The night is deep, the stars are hidden, and it's the perfect time for us to gather here and dive into the mysterious and thrilling world of tales. Prepare to be spellbound as we uncover the secrets that lie in the darkness. Let's begin this enchanting journey together. Jay has lived with his grandmother his entire life, and at the time he was about 16 years old. I asked Jay about it, and he asked me if I liked it. I told him the truth. He said Mom wouldn't get rid of it, but did put it outside. He also said you sense there's something wrong with it too, right? Did you notice that? No matter what direction you're looking at it from, it seems to be looking back at you. That definitely had gone unnoticed by me. But fast forward a week or so, though, and I noticed the clown was no longer sitting in the chair outside. So I asked my mom about it. She said her entire family was hating on it, so she got rid of it. I felt somewhat relieved that it was gone, but the house just felt different. Being she was touching on the subject, though, I just kind of dropped it. But that wasn't the end of it, though. So my mom was also raising my niece, Amy, who was just over a year old at the time. I would go over to visit, and Amy never wanted to be in a room, and I would go in there to grab some toys, and she just wouldn't walk over the threshold. She just stayed in the hallway, and when I asked her to help me to take the toys into the living room, she would just shake her head. No, I thought that she was just being that age and I left it alone. But then she became suspicious of an antique wardrobe that sat in her room when it was bedtime. I would take her in and she would stare at it warily, and then she would look at me, put her finger over her lips and cryptically say shush and point to the wardrobe. And after that she didn't want to be left in her room alone. So bedtime became difficult, trying to rock her to sleep while she fussed. Another week passed, though, and my mom called and asked me to come over. I said sure, and I drove to her house, and she said something really scared me last night. Now she'd been in bed for only about 5 minutes, laying on her side when she felt a heaviness descend behind her onto the bed. That tired feeling left her immediately as she became hyper-alert. She wasn't quite sure what to do and was trying to decide. When a male body came up behind her and pressed himself with his erect penis into her back, it put its legs over her and an arm around her torso. She froze in fear, not quite knowing what to do and trying to comprehend what was going on. She knew that she had locked all the doors just moments before heading to bed. So had someone come into the house with evil intent? She said that she put her hand on the man's hand that was over her torso. When her finger felt very long and pointy fingernails at the end of its 3 fingers and a thumb. She could feel breath on the back of her neck, and she knew that it was waiting for her to make the next move. She struggled to get up, but it held her fast and wouldn't let her move. She knew that she had to think quick, and she mustered up her best, pissed off voice, and firmly said, "Let go of me." He just pressed harder and held her tighter, though louder, this time with real anger in her voice. She said, "Get off of me, you bastard." She kicked and struggled, and finally it let go of her. She jumped out of bed, immediately flicked on the light to find nothing but her empty bed. She looked on the other side of the bed, underneath it, in the closet, everywhere. She even went through the entire house, checking her grandkids' rooms before looking in every closet and cranny in the house, only to find that no one else was there but a family with the door still locked from the inside. I was obviously shocked. I didn't know what to say. My mama has never been wanting to make up stories, especially like that, so I really had no choice but to believe her. I knew she hadn't dreamt it, but I also just didn't understand why. But I'm also acutely aware that spirits seemed to follow her and our entire family from house to house as well, so this wasn't totally out of the ordinary for our family. Another week passed without things happening. There'd be a mug placed on the kitchen counter to fill with coffee, but when Jay turned around with the pot to fill, it was just no longer there. He would look around and finally find the mug down the hall, in the bathroom or something. Amy also would not enter her room without an anal. then cow while pointing at the closet or the wardrobe. And there were constant oddities like that. But things finally came to her head one night. So my mom called me in the morning again and asked if I could come as soon as possible. She sounded quite frantic, so I headed over immediately. Amy was watching a kids program in the living room, so my mom could speak to me in the kitchen, and she said something really bad had happened the night before. She was sitting in the living room getting Amy ready for bed, when she heard a loud slam against the wall down the dark hallway where Amy's room was. They both immediately became stiff and stared down towards the room. My mom said that whatever was coming down the hall towards them made a loud flapping sound that got louder the closer it got to them. My mom hugged Amy to it tightly as a pair of enormous black wings came barreling at them, then paused at the entrance to the stairs by the kitchen, pivoted and loudly shrieked as it spiraled down the stairs into the basement, stunned. My mom and Amy sat there for a moment, not moving or saying anything. Finally, Amy led away from Grandma, cautiously, made her way towards the stairs and looked down. And when Amy turned to Grandma, she pointed down the stairs and whispered, "Shush." My mom all but lost it. Amy slept on the couch that night while my mom slept in her easy chair, and my mom was shaking by the end of the story and she had tears in her eyes. She said to me, "I need you here because I have to do something important." She went down to the hallway to Amy's room and I heard the closet door open. And when she came back cradling the clown doll in her arms, I swore her. Amy saw the clown and ran to me frantically saying, "Shush, shush," and was crying in fear. My mom said that she needed to take the doll out front to throw it out, but first she was going to smash that porcelain head to bits. When she went outside, Amy clung to me in tears. My mom knew that Amy was going to need me when she went outside with the clown. Again and again my mom slammed the clown's head against the pavement, but no matter how many times or even how violently she did, it just would not break. Oh, after many attempts to shatter the head failed, my mom defeatedly buried it in the garage. That would be picked up the next day, but she couldn't do anything else at that point, but just have it gone from their life. Later I asked her why she kept it, and she said that it just felt right buying it, and she absolutely adored it. But the rest of us were creeped out by it, with good reason, obviously. She said that she put it at the top of Amy's closet one day when Amy was at daycare and she had covered it so that it wouldn't be seen. When I went in there, I hadn't seen it and neither did Amy, but I definitely felt something was off in the house. Every time I went over, she had assured me that it was gone, so I trusted her. But Amy felt it too and was scared by what resided not only in the closet but also in the wardrobe. Jay felt it and experienced strange things as well, but nothing compared to those black wings and the thing in my mom's bee. Needless to say, all the weird stuff it stopped after that. My mom has always trusted my intuition, and hers was certainly off that day in the thrift shop. But I always say we always choose what's familiar to us. When you live in haunted houses, your whole life, that becomes your normal, however abnormal that may seem to others. And the normally my mom felt when she saw that damn clown felt good somehow, no matter how much the rest of us felt the evil it possessed. This happened in my hometown when I was 7 and I'm female 36. Now for context. I lived off of an island off the coast of Washington State, in a military town that is among one of the safest places to live in all of the US. But, as you guys are probably all aware, weirdos are everywhere. The timing is vague for me, but since I was outside playing with my friends, it's likely that it was a summer evening just before dinner time. We were screwing around riding our bikes in the street, just running around the usual kid stuff, when a car pulled up and stopped in the middle of the street. I don't remember exactly what the man riding had said, but he must have beckoned me over there, because I know that I walked close enough to hear him. He asked me if I had seen any other kids wandering around, because his were missing. I noticed then that there was also a woman in the car with him, so I assumed that she was the mom and he must have been the dad. I said no, that I hadn't seen any kids wandering around. But there was a park nearby around the corner, and you might be able to find him there. Not that I was super proud of myself for thinking of this at 7. The man then asked if I'd be willing to get into the car and show them where the park is. Although I didn't understand just how dangerous this was, I was well aware of the whole stranger danger thing, so I said no. He asked again if I could please get into the car and help him find his children at the park, and I said, no, sorry, I can't do that. But I gave him directions to the park, and then I skipped off to continue playing with my friends, who was standing there just watching the whole time, and after that he drove away. A few minutes later my mom came outside to call me in for dinner, and I bounced happily up the driveway to tell her how I'd helped someone. I was very excited at the time to have done this for an adult, which will bring me to my final part at the end of this, and then I explained the whole thing to her. Face changed a bit, but she just nervously said, that's very nice of you. And I felt a surge of pride. And then my dad came home, solid Navy dude. Black belt, used to be in the pararescue. And so badass that Chuck Norris checks under his bed for my dad every night. And my mom obviously told him what happened, and his reaction was much different. He told me that, although he was proud that I liked to help people, that I was never, ever to approach anyone that I didn't know like that. Again he said, and I'll never forget this, and has since passed this wisdom on to my daughter, remember, adults should never be asking children for help like that. He told me that I was lucky and that I hadn't got snatched, and to always remember it, because they would have lost me forever if things had gone badly. He was very stern, which hurt my little ego, and I lost a tiny bit of innocence that day. And now that I had 30 years of knowing my dad, he was only stern, because that's his reaction, and also anger when he gets scared. And I mean the poor dude. Before that I had escaped as a toddler and was found on a cliff in Japan, and then I left the yard another time in San Antonio to sell my coloring book pages door-to-door, and I'm sure that he was wondering what fresh hell he was in for this time with a child like me. To wrap it up, though, I don't remember if my parents did anything with what I had told them, but it's almost unlikely that they did, because they're pretty solid, loving folks. To my knowledge, however, nothing ever really came of it, and I never heard about any instances like that. Again, when I was around 13, me and my dad went on a canoe trip. It took 3 days, but it was a pretty calm river, and honestly quite beautiful too. The first day was just amazing and fun all the way around the sun and the water and nature, and it was an amazing time. Night came and we took up shelter on a beach for the night. As we sit by the campfire, I see the water in the river splash, and remember it's almost rapid. Yelling calm, and I tell my dad, and he looks and says that it's probably just some fish. I think, though, that it's multiple monster fish. If so, because these splashes were huge. We finish up and retire to the tents. In the middle of the night, I wake up to reposition, and I swear that I hear a girl and a guy talking. It's faint, but nobody should even be close to us. It's not that loud. I shrug it off and eventually go back to sleep, just thinking that maybe there's some other people out here. Next morning we head out, and again it's a great day, and I swim and relax in the beaches and not a person around. But Dad. We lunch at the beach and continue down the river. And as it hits about 4 or 5 in the afternoon, my dad tells me that we need to consider finding a good spot for the night. And minutes later I notice a girl on the bank in a tree. But she's like at the top, and the tree is huge. It freaks me out because we are in the middle of nowhere. And who sits in a tree, 60 FT up, just chilling in this remote area? Anyway, night comes and some stuff occurs, and we eat and start a fire. It's about 10 p.m. and we're going to turn it, and I hear cracking sticks off at the wooden edge. I glance over and it's the same girl from the tree. I instantly freak out and I tell my dad to look. But by the time that he looks, she's back in the tree line. I'm scared, so I ask to sleep in his tent and he agrees, seeing how spooked I am. Night goes by uneventful, besides the constant limbs breaking, which was more than the usual, but not anything crazy. Maybe I was just uneasy. Who knows? But the final morning arrives and we load up to leave and I realize that the fire is smoldering. But I soaked it with buckets of water and it appears that there's more wood in it now. This kind of sketches me out more. But the last day. So I just say to myself, let's go. We load up and start going down. The final 8-hour canoe ride afternoon was fun. Doing the same stuff got to 2 hours till load off. Beach and I'm checking out the scenery and my heart just drops because on the beach in full view is the same girl beaten and bloodied up. Very rough looking. I make eye contact as we pass by and this time my dad sees her to clear as day. At this point he starts paddling faster. We get about 10 or 15 ft ahead and she screams the craziest and just scariest scream that I've ever heard. She starts running down the bank beside the river and she's like unreasonably fast. But we're paddling hard and I'm screaming. But we can't gain much ground, even with the current. We get even with her again and she stops running. We keep paddling like our life depends on it, and I look back to her. She's now stopped on the bank and then she slowly starts walking into the water without reaction until she's just completely under. We paddled fast as humanly possible upon seeing that. And the last 2 hours took us like only 30 minutes. I don't know if she was crazy or a ghost or I don't know. But I'm never going back there ever again. So a couple of months ago me and my family of 4+2 dogs moved house from living in a village to living in a small old farmhouse. The new house is a 10-minute drive away from the nearest town, so it's not too far, but it's one of 2 houses in the area. The other's house occupants were in the process of moving out, so they were rarely home, with hardly anything surrounding it apart from fields and one tucked-away house and one road connecting us to the town. A few days after officially moving there and unpacking most of our stuff, my parents had to go out to work. Their jobs usually mean that on weekdays I have to wait until they finish work for them to pick me up and drive me home. On weekends, this means that I stay home unbothered until around evening when my parents get home while my brother wakes up. He usually sleeps for like 16 hours at a time due to his crowded schedule or something. Don't ask. On this particular weekend, though, my parents decided that after work they were going to visit a friend's house on the other side of the area. My brother was home, but he was determined to stay asleep and told me not to bother him under any circumstance. So, basically I had the house to myself for the whole day, with no jobs or work to do, apart from like walk the dogs and stuff. But anyway, so, around 6 in the afternoon it was already getting dark outside. Not so dark that you couldn't see anything, but dark enough that anything you could see was basically just a silhouette with vague features. I was watching YouTube in my room upstairs when I saw the headlights of a car slowly making their way down the very long road towards our house, and my first thought was that something was wrong. But then I realized that the car was probably for the one other house next to ours, whose occupants were just moving out, coming to collect their stuff or something. But due to me not thinking much of the car, I just continued watching YouTube. In the end, not even 2 minutes later, though, I hear my youngest dog sounding off downstairs, and I instantly get the worst vibe I felt in a long time. So I decided the best course of action would be to go downstairs and investigate what was causing my dog to bark. But since no one had been downstairs since the morning, all of the lights were turned off and it was dark, apart from a few lamps in the living room. When I got downstairs I looked to see where the dog was barking, and it was out the window. My dog eventually stopped barking as much since I was there now, but just to make sure everything was fine, I looked at the window to see what the cause of his distress was. When I opened the curtains enough so that I could get a clear look at the window, I saw a car still running sitting in the front of my garden. It took me a quick second in the dark to also notice that the front gate to my garden was open. My garden is surrounded by a low stone wall with a wooden fence on a latch. I then realized that a man that I had never seen before was standing just beyond the gates of the house, looking through the upstairs windows, presumed life or human activity. I stared in bewilderment at this person. For what? For like a really long moment before he turned and looked into the window that I was staring out of. We locked eyes for about 3 seconds. He looked as shocked as I was. Moments later, he started running towards the car, and in my shock, I didn't know what to do but run upstairs and get my brother by then. The dogs had made enough noise to wake my brother up, so I ran into his room and frantically yelled at him to come downstairs and look. But by the time that I managed to get him downstairs, the car had turned around and was just pulling away. The road outside my house leads to a dead end, and it's really hard to turn around. There isn't much space. It usually takes a minute to do so, but we saw the car speed off down the driveway, and we just stood in shock for a while before either of us spoke. We decided that I should call our parents and tell them to come home and explain what happened. After around another hour or so, both my parents were home, and neither of them actually believed me. Brushing it off was probably just someone lost, and told me that there was no need to call the police. So I kind of felt really dumb for a while. But fast forward about 3 days, and I was in school talking to my friends, and I found out that on that exact night that this occurred, there had been a string of serial robberies around the area, and mainly isolated farmhouses were hit. Since then, I've started looking the front door even in the daytime, and I have a bit of a panic attack every time my dogs start barking or I see a car coming towards the house. It was a frightening experience, and I'm glad that it turned out the way that it did, because it could have gone very differently. So this happened when I was roughly 3 or 4 years old. I think I saw it. And me and my family had just moved into a new house after the rent on our old house got too high, and my mom just couldn't pay it anymore. So one day, about a week or so after moving in, me and my mom were home alone. My older sisters were at school. My mom was in the kitchen making me lunch and doing the laundry, when she heard me giggling and talking in my bedroom. She didn't think anything of it, because it's fairly normal for kids to talk to themselves when playing with toys and all that sort of stuff. But when she brought me my lunch, she found me half laying under my bed talking. She asked who I was talking to, and I emerged from under the bed and replied, "I'm talking to my friend Rose. Can't you see her? She's under my bed now." My mom doesn't believe in the paranormal or anything, but this gave her the creeps. She made me eat my lunch in the living room and told me to watch cartoons so that she could keep an eye on me. Fast forward a couple of days, and my mom has a neighbor over for coffee, and I'm sitting on the floor playing with my toys. Somehow the topic of Rose came up, and my mom was telling the neighbor about it. And the neighbor started asking me questions about Rose, like, what did she look like, what we spoke about, etc. So I answered, "Oh, she's older than me. She's a teenager, and she's got ginger hair and green eyes." She tells me about her mommy. Her mommy was bad. My mom, for as long as she lives, will never forget the look on the neighbor's face. The neighbor then asked to talk to my mom privately, and it wasn't until recently that I found out what the neighbor had told him. It turns out that Rose wasn't just an imaginary friend, because she was the girl who had previously lived in this house. From what I've been told, Rose was a 16-year-old girl who lived in the house with her mom about 10 years before we moved in. Her mom was an abusive alcoholic, and from what I've heard, that's why Rose Rosemary ended her life at the playbook across the street. She was apparently just sick of her abuse, and then it all saddens me thinking of her, because as someone who's been close to this sort of stuff, as someone who's dealt with various forms of abuse, I do feel the pain, and I just wish that she had the support that I had when I was in that dark place. So after listening to a bunch of these, I decided to share one of my own encounters. So I wasn't still living in BC at the time. I was 17 and living with my mom, but working full-time. I normally left the house at about 4 a.m. to walk to work. For 4:30 a.m. I started my walk like I did every other morning. Got myself bundled up, it was during the winter, and put my headphones in and started my journey to work. I get a couple of houses down from my mom's place, and a guy steps out onto the sidewalk. He shouts something out to me that I don't quite understand, because I have my music in my ears. So I pull out my earbud and ask him to repeat himself. He looks at me with this wide-eyed look, and I immediately regretted asking him to repeat what he said. But he goes, "Jesus loves you," in a creepy kind of sing-song voice. I'm like, "Thanks, I guess," and he's like, "And Jesus wants me to take your life at this point." My blood just ran cold. The street was empty. Besides us, I was trained in martial arts at the time, so I kind of shifted my stance, knowing full well that I would still get my escape. But I didn't want to show fear. I reached into my pocket and grabbed the pepper spray that my mom had handed me earlier, for when I walk around at such an early hour. I showed her to him and screamed with all that I could to leave me alone. I said to him, "Leave me alone right now, I'm going to call the police." He then says, "Jesus loves you." Again, I don't really know how to share it in such a way that could truly match the tone of which he said it in, but it was creepy. He kind of half sung it, half said that in a mocking tone, and skipped. Yes, skipped. Like a child who's excited about receiving a candy or a toy away from me. I walked down the road a bit further and called my parents on the house phone from my cell, so the ringing would wake someone up. And when my dad answered, I practically shouted at him to meet me outside with my mom and to bring the phone out in case this freak decided to follow me home. Upon getting home, I called the police and they told me something similar had happened to a girl my age and she kept walking. But when she turned the corner, 3 other guys attacked her and almost killed her because it was so dark. I couldn't really make out the details about this guy. All I could really tell is that he was high or something. I stayed home for 3 days and refused to leave my house because it happened not more than 3 houses down from where I lived. The police couldn't really do anything, as I didn't have a description, and they weren't sure if the attackers and the taunting "Jesus loves you" guy were together, or if it was just crap. Luck for that girl. By the way, I sure hope that I never see that guy again. I used to live in an old wooden shack that my great-grandfather built. It was old, damp, and smelled funny. We would go there every summer with my cousins, and we would have the best time. My mother and I actually started living there full-time when my grandmother gave the house to her as a present as well. We lived there for about 3 years before we knocked it to build a new house. As the shack was beginning to fall asunder, and while living there I would occasionally wake up in the middle of the night and see miniature silhouettes sitting on the top of my wardrobe, dangling or kicking their legs like a child in a chair. Almost sometimes they would sit on the end of my bed too, and they were perfectly proportional but were smaller than most humans. I suppose they never really caused any harm, just kind of frightened me. I suppose in the foundations of our new house, my grandmother had placed a miraculous medal, a religious relic, in the cement. Now, just to be clear, I'm not a religious man in any way, shape, or form. But when we moved into this new house, there was no sign of the many shadows anymore. A few years later, we did some renovations to the house. We were staying at my grandmother's house while the work was being done and the wall containing the medal was knocked. In the process, I was the first to move back in alone. I'd gone down before everyone else, so I could paint my sister's room as a favor. On the first night, after a long day of painting, I went into my room and got comfy watching YouTube videos. All the doors and the windows were closed and I had a can of light deodorant on my desk that I put there earlier in the day and nowhere near the edge, when I was rudely interrupted by the can being flung across the room and smashing off of the floor, almost as if something was welcoming me home, welcoming me back to the madness. A week later, the rest of my family moved in and everything was normal. One night my sister started bawling, crying in a room. My mother went to comfort her and she told her that she saw little people in her room dancing around, the same ones that had pestered me at her age. I still live there and I haven't seen them in years. I get reoccurring nightmares of an adult-sized one standing over me in my bed, sometimes sporting sharp teeth and sunken eyes. But there's occasional voices and whispers in my room, And we've also caught a lot of what paranormal investigators refer to as this room. It's an ongoing issue for me in this house, and honestly, I just cannot explain it. I live in a really small house in the southernest, and I've lived here for about maybe 6 months. And my house is considered a mother-in-law house on my landlord's property. So it's really just a small downstairs and small upstairs. But it works well for me, since I don't have many things. The little house itself has been on the landlord's property for about 80 years now. It was actually shipped here from out of state, and the owners at the time re-cemented it into the ground. I've never had any issue in the house, or suspicious or unexplained things go on. However, I've never felt entirely comfortable on the second floor of the house. Either for some reason because I just regularly get the feeling that I'm being watched or that there's another presence in the room. Something. It's not a feeling that I would previously get in other homes that I've lived in, but it's almost atmospheric, if that's the right way to explain it. I find it a little bit unsettling and can ignore it most of the time. But last night, as I got into bed and pulled the blankets over me, I turned my head to the side to sleep, and I swear to you that I felt pressure being applied to the blanket that was near my head. It only lasted about 2 seconds, but it was gentle, and I felt it move across a few inches down from my head. At first, I assumed that it's my cat walking over to me, so I turned to look for her. And when I do, there's nothing there in the moment. I just ignored it, and I turned my lights off. It did cross my mind as a little bit strange, and I went on to wake up several times throughout the night, though this was somewhat normal for me. Though I also noticed that my bathroom motion sense of light was turning on multiple times throughout the night while I was up, which I must admit it made me feel uneasy. And when I woke up for work this morning, it just kind of struck me that it almost felt like a finger slowly moving from my head to my neck. There's a part of me that sees all of this as just kind of happen. SDS, but I can't repress the uncomfortable feeling I get upstairs any longer, and the little things happening last night weren't quite adding up. I'm also feeling even more uncomfortable about going up there to sleep tonight, so wish me luck. I guess when I was around 10, I used to live with my mom, when my parents were divorced, in a house for people with low incomes. The primary floor is where you found the common places like the living room or the kitchen, and the second floor is only made of 2 bedrooms, a toilet, and a bathroom. But there's not much space on that second floor, so you can easily see or hear anything in the toilet or the bathroom from my bedroom. Well, at the time I was out about my parents getting divorced, so in order to help me sleep easily, my mother used to set a light on upstairs and a bit of music on a computer, and this really helped for maybe a year or so until it happened. So one night, as usual, I was going to bed. I don't know how to describe it best, but it was one of those beds that had a bookshelf and a desk under it, so it was quite close to the ceiling. The music and the light were on and everything was fine. And, until the music stopped, my mother was downstairs with a friend of hers, so she couldn't hear that the music was off. But it was okay. I wasn't afraid this had happened a few times before, but then I started to hear like someone slowly walking close to the door of my bedroom, which was almost closed, in order to let some light in. The floor of this place is like plastic. It can make this like little sticky noise when you walk on it with your bare feet. And that was the sound that I heard. I could also hear my mom downstairs, so I was sure that she wasn't the one walking around here, and it continued for quite some time, and then it started to make that sound in my bedroom, right under my bed, like someone was just walking in my room and under my bed. I began to be really scared, so I tried to hide under my blankets. I could move, but I couldn't scream or make a damn noise. And finally I started to feel little vibrations inside the bed, with the noise that something was taking the stair of my bed. At that moment I turned my back. I didn't want to see it. All I could hear was the noise of the stairs and the feeling that something heavy was standing right by my side. It ended when I felt a sort of cold move from the back of my head, strong enough to go under the blanket again. I screamed so loud that my mom thought that I had a heart attack or something. She took care of me all night and told me later, years later, that when she came into the bedroom, she felt really uncomfortable in there because the room was ice cold. Since then, I've had multiple experiences on the second floor of this house. I still live in it. Actually, some scary and others just really weird, and if you guys would like to hear more about this house or if you have any questions, please let me know in the comment section below. I'm a female, 23 years old as of today, but this happened a couple of years ago. I was 19 at the time. So before I tell this story, I guess you're going to need a little bit of context. At the time, I was in my second semester at university, so most of my classes were scheduled very early in the morning. Here in my country, there's not on-campus housing or anything like that, so I had to come and go from my house to uni and vice versa. As someone who happens to use a wheelchair, finding transport was extremely difficult for me. Having that in mind me that taking a taxi where I live isn't the safest option. I've always had one particular taxi driver who moves me wherever I needed to go every day. He would come and pick me up for my classes, always on time every day, except that morning 6:45 in, and there were no signs of him. My first class was at 7, and I had to go or I wouldn't get there in time. Afraid that my grades would be affected by skipping that one class, and also against my better judgment, I decided to take a regular cab, which wasn't easy, because not that many of them would stop after seeing the wheelchair, but not enough space, they said, and I would always sigh waiting for the next one. But then one of them finally accepted to take me, and it must have been the fact that I was running late or how poor lit it was at the time. But I just gave him one glance before climbing in the car. He helped me to put my chair into the back seat before sitting in the driver's side of the car. That's when I could see him better. And yeah, he was a little ragged and a bit sketchy. His face was dirty and had multiple pimples and marks. But then again, I thought, who am I to judge? It's just a 15-minute drive and I'm already inside. So I smiled and tried to be polite, keeping my eyes up front. He seemed to be chatty, asking all kinds of questions, to which I only answered short and simple, nodding and not wanting to be rude. After a while, I just stopped answering because it was getting a little bit weird. Instead, he started telling me about his life, how he separated from his wife because he found her with another man, how he wanted to kill them both. More specifically, all the ways of how he was going to kill them as well. I was feeling freaked out by the way that he was telling me those things. His voice was just so full of rage and his face turned so red. But the look on his face, I'll never forget it. Those were the eyes of a true madman. At this point, my hand was glued to the door handle. He just kept getting angrier and angrier and angrier, and I wanted actively considered even to throw myself out of the car. Obviously I couldn't, though. He then said in a quiet, lower voice, I've done some horrible things, miss, and I just tried to keep calm. But just a few more minutes. I thought I don't remember much more of what he told me before we got to the parking lot of my uni, except as miss, the devil is inside of me. But this to say, it was a very scary ride. When he helped me out of the car, he also told me, be good or I could kill you someday. I didn't say anything, just paid him, and then I rolled away. After 5 minutes, I could see him from the center hallway still in the parking lot. He wouldn't leave and I had to do at least 3 laps of the main building until he was. I didn't want him to know where my classroom was, and even after he left, I called a friend to escort me to the class, just in case. In the end too, I was unfortunately 30 minutes late for class, but I've never been that scared and I hope I will ever be again. My father, Wayne, worked in a machine shop across town which had its fair share of characters there, and one of these people was James. Now James was one of those guys that would seem normal at first, but had one hell of a temper. One minute he'd be eating lunch and the next he'd be trying to fight you over the smallest things. Now, while my father was at work, James had come in absolutely drunk, which many other guys had done before. But James could barely function, let alone operate a mill. My father pulled him aside and told him that he needs to leave, that him coming in drunk could possibly get him or someone else hurt, which leads to him getting pissed and trying to fight my dad. James isn't a small guy too. He's 6 foot and on the largest side, while my father is only 5'6". James grabbed a metal pole too and was swinging it around trying to hit my dad. Thankfully, he didn't hit him but tore the hell out of the door before being restrained by the other world workers and was kicked out being fired. My father ended up leaving work early that day and made his way to a friend, and they had a beer and just killed his nerves. Later on in the day, 8-year-old me was home alone as my mother was at the store getting groceries. I was playing Halo 3 at the time before hearing a knock at the door, and I walked up to the door and see James through the window. Although I didn't know him well, as I've only met him once, I knew him well enough to know that he wasn't a stranger, so I opened the door. "Hey, is your father home?" He had said in the nicest tone I guess he could muster, his breath smelling of alcohol. I said no, but somehow my 8-year-old self knew well enough to not say that I was home alone. My Em is in the shower, though that was an absolute lie. Her truck wasn't even in the driveway, and it was obvious that I was home alone. He had nodded, though walking away from the door a little before I closed it, promptly locking it before going back to my game. A few minutes pass and my mother arrives home with a few groceries. Once they were brought inside, we had heard a bang at the door. Then another and another, and this was not like a knock, but more like someone was banging on our door trying to get in. My mother looked through the window before grabbing me and the phone and running into the bedroom closet, which had a lock. I had no clue what was going on, but I knew then that it wasn't good. She called 911 and said that there was a crazed man trying to break in, all the while the sound of the banging could be heard in the background. For what seemed like hours, we waited in the closet, still hearing the loud bangs, as he started charging into the door with his shoulders screaming like a maniac. After about 15 minutes, we heard the familiar sound of the police siren. As we heard the confrontation outside, it didn't take long for them to arrest the man. My mother stayed on the line with the 911 operator until we finally walked out, seeing James in cuffs in the back of the patrol car. My father had rushed home and hugged us both, James staring at us with bloodlust in his eyes, and, although it wasn't confirmed, I had a good feeling that he was just after my dad, wanting to finish the job and beating him and potentially killing him. Even he had seen my mother's truck, thinking that it was my father as he drove it into work every now and again. But in the end it was a pretty narrow escape for my dad. I think so. This happened when I was 15 and out hunting with my father and one of his friends from work. His name was Frank, who was a lot more experienced with hunting than we were. It was an archery javelina hunt nearby to Crown King, if anyone's interested. So we got pretty lucky coming up on a squadron of javelina as we were driving out to our campsite. So we stalked to them for a little bit and Frank managed to get a shot on one, but dead in the bush. After following the blood trail for a few hours, after our failed attempt of searching, we made our way back to our designated campsite, set up a camp, and it was around 3 in the afternoon, so we decided to just call it a day. At that point that night, I lay in my sleeping bag with my father, as Frank slept in a separate tent next to ours. It was a quiet night, which was to be expected, since the deserts of Arizona are usually very quiet. When I woke up around what I would assume to be like 1 in the morning, hearing walking around our tent. Or maybe even a deer. I just laid there listening and waiting for it to go away. But one sound absolutely broke the silence, though, and scared the crap out of me. Because, clear as day, right outside of our tent, You could hear a loud back, like someone saying the word back. It was aggressive and it caught the attention of my father, who stayed quiet. The silence resumed again, and maybe like 40 seconds later, almost like a recording on a tape recorder, we heard it again in different circumstances. We would have walked out to see what was going on, but everything was just way too quiet. There was no struggle like a guy fighting a man or an animal, just this person yelling back. This continued for maybe another 5 minutes. With him, occasionally yelling again. But soon the yells got quieter and we knew the man had walked away. I didn't sleep at all the rest of the night, and just kind of laid there in silence looking at the zipper to our sleeping bag, half expecting someone to start to unzip it. And thankfully that never happened. But it had been an hour before someone finally broke the silence. It was my dad, and he said, "What the?" We didn't leave the tent till we could clearly see the sun in the sky, before we heard Frank exit his tent before saying the coast was clear. Him obviously being awake from the whole incident too, and he looked just as shaken up as we were. We started a fire and my father drank some coffee, and we just stood there in silence, still trying to comprehend what we had just heard a few hours ago. Frank had finally PED up about it and he said, "Well guys, I think I saw it." Thing had to be at least 7 feet tall, unlike our tent. Frank's tent was more for summer and made for a better bug net than a tent you could clearly see at the top too, since it was nothing more than a visor. And that was how we saw it. After a little bit of thinking, we decided to end our hunt there, seeing how I was pretty shaken up by this and I didn't really feel comfortable about being out there. A few years had passed and I'm 18 at this point, and my family and Frank had gotten together to talk and just hang out. And it was at this point that he told me something that he hadn't said on a trip, trying not to scare me that day. He said that when he saw it, like computer paper wide, and it was at least 7 or possibly 8 feet tall. So this happened 3 years ago, but requires some background. My best friend and I grew up in a sleepy, wannabe New Jersey, Central Florida town, and we were the outcasts. We had met in 6th grade when I ever heard talking to another classmate about biennials at my 11-year-old self-passion at the time. But we became fast friends and soon were inseparable too. And soon began the gauntlet of sleepovers, birthday parties and family gatherings. We were practically siblings. She was the first person that I'd come out to as bisexual, and in turn I was the first person that she told about to being tread her home. Life was tumultuous, though I can't say mine was any better. In fact, we often had a habit of taking refuge at each other's houses. Like I said, we became like siblings now. Her father was an alcoholic, strict and prone to physical discipline. Her sister was a stuck-up girl who soon gravitated towards the hicks and the jocks when we entered high school, and our mother was a pseudo-vegan hippie-loved child. Although from the 80s, when I was 23, herself 22 at the time, we had another long night of sleeping over in order to let her escape yet another fight with her mother. She had recently lost a job at Walmart and I was going into my first shift at Taco Bell the next day. On the drive home the next morning, she excitedly told me that, since she now had her own vehicle, she would be applying at pizza places that were in need of a driver, and I was proud. It was the first time she hunted for a job on her own, as I'd usually been the one to coax her to apply where I was working. Not that she ever lasted very long, but anyway, my first day of training goes by quite well. My coworkers are friendly and try to get me to talk more. My manager likes to playfully embarrass me, a fat white guy, by trying to get me to talk to the other workers. Being a training day, it wasn't a very long shift, but I've been up early in anticipation, and this was my first day on a job in a few months. I got home around noon and informed some of my internet friends that my first day went well, and around 5 p.m. I started to bed down, drained from a good day. As I'm preparing to lay in my bed, I get a stream of messages, her lamenting another fight with her mother and asking if she could come over now. I had started to grow a bit weary of the fights on their end. I had begun to repair my relationship with my family and a few friends as well, and I'd given her advice many times on how to approach things, and in my infinite wisdom and eagerness to sleep, I left the message on read and drifted off into slump. Around 8 p.m., I am awakened by her bursting into my room in a panic, having just been ripped from a dream. I'm groggy and disoriented. I drag myself to the bathroom to relieve my bladder and come back to my room, finding her rocking back and forth on my bed. It's at this time that I notice that she's covered in blood, so I ask what happened. She informs me that she just saw someone murder her mother with a knife. My mind goes blank, and in the deepest parts of my mind, alarm bells start ringing. Isn't the rocking back and forth a bit overdramatic? Why didn't she call the police? But this is my best friend. I've known her for over a decade now, and we were the only two people in the world that we could count on. So I suppress it and I go and inform my sister and my stepfather. My mother had passed the year prior, and it was roughly a month to the anniversary of her death. We were all in a dark place, antisocial as always. It was the only way that we knew how to handle the emotional issues. When I inform my family, they immediately go to the same place as I had, though they're far more vocal about it. I offer excuses. I knew myself with flimsy, and I returned to my room, phone in hand. I convinced her to call the police, and I can hear her explain the detail over the phone. A man in a black ski mask. When the cops arrive, she swears up and down that it's most likely her father. They send cars over to check the crime scene and take her in for a statement. I ride with her in the back of the cop car over to the sheriff's office. It gets to be around 2 a.m. Her sister was brought in, as was her father. I have worked the next morning, and so I request to be taken home by a police officer. It takes me a while to go to sleep that morning and the next day at work. I'm really quiet until my manager asks me what had happened. I inform him but decide to work the rest of my training shift. When I get home, my sister informs me she had confessed my mother threatened to kick her out for not being able to find a job, and in a rage she had taken a kitchen knife and stabbed her repeatedly. My mind froze like a bad computer, and I turned to face my monitor. I was in a Discord call at the time, and all I could weakly say is my best friend confessed to murdering her mother before hanging up and just laying on my bed. Her last trial was the 7th of this month. I don't know the results, though. My grandmother tells me that she took a PLE deal for life in prison rather than the death penalty. I must admit that part of me wants to contest that, to demand that they take the death penalty for ridding the earth of such a peaceful, caring woman. Shadow. A larger part of me, though, is just glad that she's being punished at all. This is probably the scariest thing to ever happen to me in my real life. It happened to me a couple of months ago while I was sightseeing the West Coast. I was visiting a small, quiet beach town in Oregon called Newport. It's basically situated on a cliff, and then down below is the beach. The beach itself is basically empty, and it is huge. It goes for endless miles and seems like something out of a movie. Quite honestly, I've never really seen something so vast in my life. Anyway, I had spent most of the entire day on the beach, and when it got dark I climbed back up the cliff to where my car was. I had originally planned to sleep on the beach in a tent that I brought, but it was starting to rain, so I figured that I would just sleep in my car. I've been traveling all over Oaxaca for the last month at seeing national parks and stuff and sleeping in my car. Most nights anyway. This was literally the perfect quiet little beach town, so I figured no big deal. I got to my car, which was parked in this public lot for beachgoers at the top of the cliff. But next to my car was this sign that said no overnight parking that I hadn't seen before. So I figured, dang, I guess I'll just go find another spot close by. So I looked on the apps on my phone and saw that 10 minutes away on the outside of town was a nature preserve. As I mentioned earlier, I'd been staying at national parks and stuff, so I figured that would be a nice place to stay. The weather was beginning to get significantly worse too, and I figured that I should hurry. I drove pretty fast, and by the time that it was completely dark and storming, I entered the nature preserve, which was a single road that followed the cliff line on the coast for a couple of miles, with nothing but trees on one side and the beach on the other, and no cars, no house, no building, no people for what seems like forever. As I drove down the road a little ways, I began to feel a little uneasy. It all seemed a little creepy and I felt really alone. But the moon was shining bright through the clouds and the beach was visible, so I figured that I should be all right. I found a great peak spot on the cliff overlooking the beach and decided to back my car up on it and take a rest. I opened up the back of my Jeep and climbed in, and eventually I fell asleep. After a few hours I woke up. I wasn't sure what had woken me up, but I was awake now, and by this time the storm had turned into a full-blown monsoon. I could barely see out of my windows. The rain was so thick, but I could hear the waves of the ocean below crashing against the beach and whatnot. And the wind was blowing so loud that my car was actually shaking when I noticed water was pouring in through the cracks. My Jeep and I tried to reach for my phone so that I could turn the light on, but I realized that I left it in the front of my Jeep, which was blocked off by all my luggage, and the only way to get to it was to open up the back and step outside. And I was about to open the latch to let myself out when I heard laughter. It sounded like a child at first playing, but soon I realized that it had to be someone much older. They had to be close to the car too, because it was raining so hard that there's no way that I could hear it if it was far away. At first I figured it must be a cop trying to tell me to move on. But then again, it had to be like 3 or 4 in the morning. And why would they be all the way out here in the weather? Anyway, I froze to listen, and then I could tell that it was actually getting closer. I obviously wanted to look up and see what it was, but the way my Jeep was parked was backing up to the end of the cliff facing the beach, and my luggage was literally stuffed all through the rest of the vehicle, blocking all side and front windows. I was crammed way in the back, so at the time I was literally trapped and could only see out of the back window. And it was at that moment that I realized just how helpless I was. Her voice grew louder and louder and louder, and I could tell now that there was no way that this was a cop. She was laughing hysterically, like at the top of her lungs, almost screaming by the steady increase of volume. I could tell that she was definitely coming up to my car, and then, in between laughs, I heard a creepy voice say, "Oh well, what are you doing all the way out here?" And at that my heart dropped. I sat there, frozen solid. I didn't want to move. I remember thinking to myself, this is not happening. This can't be happening. But it was with the storm raging outside my car, my phone being nowhere in reach, me being trapped in the back of the Jeep with no easy exit, on the edge of a cliff, in the middle of nowhere, with a maniacal, laughing woman getting closer and closer. I was literally living in a full-blown horror movie, and the only thing that I could do was wait. I sat there for a few moments, and then that's when I saw her. I had poked my head up just a bit to see, out of the tiny space of this visible window that looked to the side of my vehicle, and about 10 ft or so from the Jeep I could see, through thick rain and heavy fog, a woman standing there facing not me, thank God, but the edge of the cliff towards the beach. Her arms were flailing up and down rapidly like a bird, and her head was twitching increasingly fast all over in irregular patterns. Her clothes were ripped and her voice was broken, and I mean she literally looked like the zombies on The Walking Dead. I couldn't move. Literally all the fear was built up in my head of what the source of this hysterical laughter may be coming from. In that true moment I tried rationalizing the situation to myself, like she's on drugs and has lost her mind, or this is someone joking, or literally anything. But every time I tried I would pike up and see this as something just unexplainable. I mean, it made no sense. How the hell would someone be out here? And what I'm pretty sure was a category 5 monsoon miles away from anything. No car freezing temperature. Standing up screaming in the dead of night. I found it hard to believe myself. But there she was. She kept laughing hysterically, shaking her body all over as if she was fully possessed. I couldn't understand what word she was actually shouting in between the laughs, but it sounded demonic and I was truly mortified. By the grace of God, I ended up finding a significant thick and large hunting knife stowed away in the bag next to me in the back of the Jeep, and after taking one last good look at the bewildered wild devil witch woman, I decided that it was time to say a prayer and try my best to sleep. I honestly don't know how I managed to do that. I don't think I got much in the end. Because, if I remember right, she probably stayed there for another 30 minutes howling at the moon. But somehow I did, and the next morning, when I woke up, I slowly stepped out of the GYD knife in hand. Of course, and I looked around and there was nobody there. It was almost as if it had never even happened. The sun was shining now and the beach was calm. It was just me and me alone, and it was time for me to get the hell out of here. Thank you so much for joining me in the world of Midnight Dark Stories. I hope these tales have sent shivers down your spine and sparked your imagination. Remember to subscribe, like, and share your scariest thoughts in the comments. Until the next time we meet in the darkness, keep the thrill alive.